Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Sean Quinlan. I'm a historian here at the University of Idaho and a member of the Borah Planning Committee. It gives me the greatest pleasure to be able to introduce this evening's speaker, Cynthia Enloe of Clark University. For over 60 years, the Borah has brought together distinguished speakers and personalities from across the globe in order to discuss the causes of conflict and the conditions of peace. This year's symposium on the topic of women, war, and peace is particularly apt. This is because women, alongside other groups such as children and the elderly, often bear the full consequences of violent change and upheaval. But it is also because, as we've seen from our distinguished speakers this year, that women are often significant and sometimes the primary agents in the processes of making peace, reconciliation, and rebuilding, with lots of feedback, and rebuilding in communities that have been torn apart by war and violence. Given this particular subject matter, the committee was very delighted at the opportunity to invite Professor Enloe to speak at the Borah this year. It is very rare for a scholar to be able to define her or his own field, let alone to invent an entirely new one. Cynthia Enloe has done both. As a graduate of UC Berkeley, Professor Enloe's work has pioneered the study of how women's politics affects the national and international arenas. In works like The Morning After, Sexual Politics at the End of the Cold War, published in 1993, Bananas, Beaches and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics, published in 1989, and Maneuvers, The International Politics of Militarizing Women's Lives, published in 2000. Professor Enloe has explored the concrete ways in which gender has intersected with militarization, globalism, and identity politics on the world level. In addition to these scholarly accomplishments, she also serves upon the editorial boards of numerous scholarly journals. She has lectured worldwide, has received numerous fellowships, awards, and honors, has contributed to forums such as The Village Voice, and has been interviewed on the BBC and NPR. Her talk tonight is entitled, Why Do Governments Encourage Women to Support Their Wars? It's my very great pleasure to welcome Cynthia Enloe.
Hi there. Is that on? It is? Wow. Okay. Is the answer yes? The answer is yes. Yeah. Yes. Good. It's very nice to be here at the University of Idaho. It's my first visit to Moscow and to the university, and I've had a terrific day today. I've been with students and faculty and staff. I've been at the wonderful Women's Center. I've had such a terrific time, so I want to thank the Borah Symposium Organizing Committee for putting all those things in place to make sure that in 24 hours I got as much of UI culture as possible. I ate at the wonderful Mike's tonight, the height of culinary treats of Moscow. I got to eat at the Breakfast Club this morning. I understand the thing I have to do is come back to go to the co-op. I understand that's the thing I have really missed, right? So, as they say, leave them wanting more. So I have to come back for the co-op. I understand Friday night dinner. Is that especially the place to be? So I'm delighted. I really am. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored to be sharing the program with Sister Lorraine. I've been having the pleasure of talking with Sister Lorraine all day about her very important work in Bougainville, and it's really a model for us all, and it reminds us, in fact, there are things we can all do, and it also reminds us that people who are activists on the ground are the smartest thinkers of them all. Many thanks to the committee for making sure that we overlapped and that I got tutored at least for a day. What I thought might be interesting to do tonight together is talk about the ways in which governments depend on women in order to wage war. And the reason I'm doing that is because oftentimes I think we imagine, and we're encouraged to imagine, that the main way to think about women and war and women in armed conflict, and as you'll see, women in militarism, and they're not all the same, is to think of women as being affected by militarism or being affected by war or armed conflict. And that's absolutely important. Women and their dependent children. That's the phrase that's used by the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The phrase used is women and their dependent children are 2/3 of all refugees in the world. And the numbers of refugees in the world, of course, as you probably are aware, is growing almost exponentially every decade. So it is very important to talk about the impacts of both militarism and war on women. But what we oftentimes are not encouraged to think about, and certainly for many years as a political scientist, I wasn't encouraged to think about, is the ways in which women's labor, both emotional and physical, in fact, are dependent upon to even wage war or to prepare for war or to prepare whole societies to be ready to go to war. That is, to think that war is natural. And that really gets closer to thinking about how ideas about women and ideas about men, ideas about masculinity and ideas about femininity, how all those four sets of ideas are actually causes for war and militarism, not just the impacts that they have. And if you don't think this is maybe a stretch, I actually think that thinking causally, thinking about what causes what, that's really radical thinking, right? By radical thinking, radical comes from the word for root. And to be radical, you can speak very softly and say very radical things, right? For instance, if you say that ideas about femininity are in fact part of the causes of war, that's very radical. So to think radically is to think of impacts and then go deeper than impacts and think about causality. Because if we can get at causality, we have a better chance of changing things. Put it the other way, if we don't think about causality, how will we change anything? So I'm going to just talk about two women, real women, out there in the world, and just show their stories as ways in which ideas about women are at the causal level of what causes countries, including our own, to become militaristic and what governments need in order to wage wars. And so the first woman that I've started to follow, I have a notebook. Well, that sounds much too organized. What would you think I had? I have a box. Somebody said a box, because you have a box, don't you? Yes, right. And actually, that sounds a little too organized. I have several boxes, right? And they do have different colored files. Isn't that a sign you're organized? Right? If like there's yellow and blue and green, so that says I'm organized. Anyway, I have several boxes full of folders following several different women that I'm trying to follow and make sense of in order to understand how wars are waged and how women's emotional and physical labor are depended upon for governments that want to wage wars, even if they don't admit it, especially if they don't want to admit it. So this woman, amongst the women I've been trying to follow, is a woman named Charlene Kane. Charlene Kane is a woman in her early 50s. She's from Berlin, Wisconsin. Anyone here from Wisconsin? Do we have any Wisconsiners? We have a couple of Wisconsiners here. You're probably not too far away from Berlin. I think I'm pronouncing it the way people from Wisconsin pronounce it. Not Berlin, Berlin, Wisconsin. Now, Charlene Cane comes from this small rural town, and she has a son. She has a son and a daughter, and I'll get to her daughter in a minute. But she has a son, and her son is named Michael. And Michael kind of floundered in high school, and he finished high school in 2003. Was kind of aimless. He was enthusiastic about Green Bay Packer paraphernalia, and I can understand that. I'm a big Packers fan. You know, they play in the cold and they play outside. That's my kind of team. So he was enthusiastic about the Green Bay Packers and also about anything to do with Harley-Davidson motorbikes. But otherwise, he didn't have a lot of ambition or very much focus. And Charlene, his mother, was quite worried about him. I mean, what was he going to do? And so he came home one day and said that he was interested in enlisting in the military, in the Army in particular. And his mother wasn't too sure whether she was enthusiastic herself about this, but on the other hand, like a lot of moms, she thought, well, at least it'll give him focus, maybe he'll get some training, maybe it will encourage him to grow up and feel a little more responsible. So she didn't put any obstacles in the way to his signing up, and Michael signed up, and he became trained as a truck driver, and he was deployed quite early on to the U.S. military occupying forces in Iraq as a convoy driver. And in 2004, you can imagine where this story might be going. In 2004, his truck was hit by or he ran over a roadside bomb. He was very severely injured. He was medevaced out very quickly, as now a lot of American troops are, to Germany and then to the Walter Reed Hospital. But he did have to have his left leg amputated. Now, the Walter Reed Hospital has been in the news a lot today, and for the first time, and you've probably seen the same coverage I have, for the first time, we now have a sense that there's the Walter Reed Hospital and then there's the Walter Reed Hospital. That is, there is the principal wards, and luckily that's where Michael was sent for the most, particularly for amputees. And then there was the infamous Building 18 that none of us had ever heard about that turns out to be kind of a holding area. This is the one where they found rat droppings. This is where soldiers wounded were being kept on because their papers weren't being signed. They got very little attention. This is the news that has come out about the two aspects of Walter Reed Hospital. Michael Cane was sent to the ward that, in fact, is usually on show when presidents and dignitaries and members of Congress go to visit. But he was having, not surprisingly, he was having a very, very tough time. He wasn't somebody, according to his mother, he wasn't somebody who had a lot of emotional stamina anyway. Now he's, at that point, he's a 19-year-old boy who has, young man who has just lost his left leg. He was in quite severe depression. If you know anybody who has gone through amputation, you know that, in fact, it is a very arduous set of both operations after the original amputation and also very, very tough and strenuous therapy to get one up to the point that you can actually be a functioning person again. And it takes emotional stamina to do that. Now, this is one of the things that becomes interesting in this story. By the way, this was written up by a very good, thoughtful reporter. The only reason we know about Charlene Cane is because a reporter who was writing for the New Yorker magazine decided to make this a feature story. Otherwise, we wouldn't know this. This set of circumstances and how it has played itself out in Charlene Cane's life. what we know is that the health team that was working with Michael at Walter Reed Hospital decided that as a policy that it was very important that all of the soldiers who were having severe injury, post-injury recuperation, have their mothers come to Walter Reed Hospital to help take care of them, especially not to do the first line of nursing, but to be there to encourage them to go through what is very painful and very difficult post-amputation therapy. Now, of course, they're right in many ways. That is, that a health team, as good as they might be professionally, need a parent to go along. But the thing is that, is Charlene Cane able to go? Is she able to leave her other responsibilities in Berlin, Wisconsin? Did anyone sort of plan a whole package to make it possible for Charlene Cane to manage to deal with the aftermath of a government's foreign policy? And this reporter, being a very good, thoughtful reporter, went to Berlin to see, in fact, what did it take for Charlene, who got the message from the health team at Walter Reed, to come back to Washington to play this vital role in her son's recovery. And here's what it turns out is her circumstance. She is the main income earner in a complex extended family. Her husband had suffered, he's still alive, but he had suffered a serious back injury on the job. He had quite minimal Social Security income coming in. But he could not support this family on his own, and furthermore, Charlene Cane was taking pride in her own work. She works as a bookkeeper at a Wisconsin county welfare office, not exactly a high-paying job. And in addition, she had her daughter living at home because her daughter has mental health problems. Her daughter has since had a child. And so Charlene and her husband took in both the daughter and the daughter's child. This is the family that Charlene Cane is responsible for. There was no way that the county health office or welfare office was going to give her 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks off to go back to Washington. So how did the Walter Reed Hospital's health team get the help they thought they needed for a wounded post-Iraq soldier? This is how it evidently happened. Charlene's workmates on the job, 5 different women, got together and figured out a strategy so that Charlene wouldn't lose a penny of her income. They all worked out an elaborate multi-week schedule so they every day would take over some part of her job. And they did this so that Charlene Cane was able to come to Washington to be part of Michael's therapy. On the other hand, not a single penny of her paycheck would be lost to the household. Those women, out of friendship, were making, that's what governments, I don't mean just the US government, that's what governments depend on. They depend on those sorts of relationships which are not made, those relationships are not made out of commitment to a foreign policy. They aren't made out of even a commitment to a certain military operation. They are made out of commitments that are very personal and individual, and most of those women would not say that they were acting politically. Well, in some ways, they're not acting politically, but their actions are political. Does that make sense? Right? And so Charlene Cane comes to Washington. She helps Michael at least inch his way out of depression to begin to engage with therapy that is going to have to go on for a long time. After a month or so, the Walter Reed Hospital folks, trying to do as best they can. Now remember, he's in the ward that has not had the problems. He's not in Building 18. They send him home. Okay, now what? Charlene Cane is essentially the head of a complex household. Added to that household now is a brand new young man who's had his left leg amputated. The description of Charlene Cane's life, she goes back to work at the county welfare office as a bookkeeper. But at night, and this is good reporting, by the way, this is a male reporter, this is a good reporting. The reporter could have stayed at Walter Reed Hospital, right? The reporter actually sees Michael as the center character in his real story. But in fact, he gives attention to the whole household and especially to Charlene Cane, Michael's mother. And he describes, so he spends time at the Cane household, and he describes at night Charlene Cane, and you can just picture it because a lot of you do it for other reasons, standing, not sitting, standing at the kitchen counter at the end of her work day after she's, helped the household get settled, and spending about 2 hours a night on Veterans Administration and Department of the Army forms. Because there's no guarantee that Michael will get the series. He's going to have more operations, and then more operations. He's going to have drug therapy, and then more drug therapy. He's going to have physical therapy, and then more physical therapy. Under which benefit plan will each of those come? That's Charlene Cane's now responsibility. Michael's in no condition to handle reams of paper. And so it's going to be up to Charlene Cane to make sure that Michael gets the years of therapy and medical attention that he can get. The household certainly can't pay for it. It will have to come from one form of either Department of the Army or Veterans Administration, and if you slip between the two, you can be in big trouble. That's where we leave Charlene Cane. But for how many years will she be the activist mother of a veteran? Now, in no part of the story do we get any sense of what Charlene Cane's ideas are about war, about the current administration, about foreign policy, about political change in the Middle East. And again, in that sense, she doesn't come across as political. But is she political? Oh, yes. Because governments cannot wage wars. And I'm talking about all kinds of governments. I'm talking about the government of the Congo. I'm talking about the government of France. I'm talking about the government of Vietnam. I'm talking about every government that either prepares for war or wages war has to have women as mothers who don't think of themselves as political, but just think of themselves trying to be good mothers, carrying the burden of care of soldiers who come home. And that care governments count on will not be politicized. So that when Cindy Sheehan, who many of you I'm sure have heard of, spoke out about her son being killed as a U.S. soldier in Iraq. In fact, it came as a shock. That is, why would a mother politicize her own grief, right? That was the way the story was pitched about Cindy Sheehan. Cindy Sheehan and I, of course, she's the celebrity and I'm just this academic, but she and I appeared on a thing together in Syracuse this fall, and of course her name's Cynthia as well. And she's very tall. I don't know if maybe you all have seen her, but we looked like Mutt and Jeff, I mean, there was Cindy Sheehan and I looked like this little squirt. But her breaking the silence and how stunned everybody was and how much everybody thinks they should have a view on Cindy Sheehan and the media scrambling to figure out what they thought of Cindy Sheehan. What is stunning to me about that is that there are literally thousands of Charlene Canes. And if you take all war waging in all countries over even just the last 3 generations, there are literally, no hyperbole here, there is literally millions of Charlene Canes who are presumed to privatize their own coping with the consequences of war. And that when a woman speaks out as a mother about war, that is considered somehow breaking the feminine, not the feminist, the feminine mold of what the good mother is. Because the good mother is oftentimes defined as somebody who privatizes her own responsibilities, does not make them the basis for challenging or critiquing or supporting, for that matter, government foreign policy. So Charlene Cane is a very important person, I think, for us, because she suggests how much governments depend, that's the pillar holding up war waging, depends on women privatizing their relationships to men and some women as soldier sons and soldier daughters. Take away that presumption about the privatization of mothering, and in fact, you have a very different political landscape. Mothers have always worried governments, all right? They worry governments when they're not producing enough children, especially enough sons. Thus, the Japanese nationalist right, that is the government of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the long-ruling government in Japan, is very worried about the plummeting birth rate in Japan. The French government is very anxious about the declining birth rate in France. There is a lot of concern about mothers if, in fact, they do see their mothering as a political stance from which to think about foreign policy. And governments will come down very hard on women who think through their politics from mothering. So, for instance, Milosevic, the authoritarian head of government in Yugoslavia, and particularly of Serbia, when it invaded Bosnia, mothers at first, in fact, challenged Milosevic's effort to broaden the draft, and this would be in 1992. And when mothers marched in Belgrade, the Milosevic police came down very hard on those mothers. That is, the level of intolerance for any questioning of the male military conscription system, because it would threaten the nationalist expansionist agenda, was very swift. You can see government's concern about mothers also in recruiting advertising. And probably some of you who are good watchers of recruiting ads, we had a good discussion at supper about the Spanish language ads that the Defense Department are now putting up in international soccer game television programs. But if you watch television ads, you can see the ways in which mothers are positioned so that they will at least not object to when especially their sons, less so their daughters, think about enlisting. So there is an ad that came out last year, and this is the script of the ad. It's very sophisticated, very subtle. There are no flags waving. There's no Star-Spangled Banner in the background. It's done in kind of sepia, kind of brown and white and black, that kind of tones. And I should tell you that the ad was put on between reruns of Law and Order and Judging Judy at about 2 in the afternoon. And all of you in communications know it's not just the advertisement, it's the timing. That is, it was put on at a time when presumably, I don't know which mothers they know, but presumably the people who are watching television at 2 o'clock on a workday afternoon would be more likely to be mothers than fathers. They put on fathers' ads too, and they time them differently. Here's how the ad runs. It's done by the Burnett Advertising Agency, which has gotten the very lucrative Defense Department advertising budget. If any of you are interested in advertising agencies, look and see which advertising agency gets the Army, the Air Force, and the Marines ad accounts. It's very lucrative, and the way to follow that is look in Advertising Age. That's the industrial journal for the advertising industry. The camera is sitting right up close at a kitchen table. A woman is sitting there at the kitchen table, middle-aged woman, African-American woman, sitting there at the kitchen table, and a young man, quite a handsome young African-American man, maybe 18, 19, walks into the kitchen, and it's all done quite close up. Again, there's no music in the background or anything, and the son says to his mom, who's sitting there, he says, "Mom, I think I figured out how we can do it." And she said, "What do you mean how we can do it?" She said, "We know how we've really been trying to figure out a way for me to go to med school." He says to his mom, "I think I figured out how we can do it. I can enlist in the Army, and they will eventually pay for me going to med school." Now, that's not quite true, actually. You have to read the very, very small print. It's like a camel going through an eye of a needle to actually get your full education benefits as a military personnel in 2007 United States. But that is certainly one of the enticements for a lot of people, young people and their parents, for considering enlisting. And so the young African-American man continues with his mom and says, "Mom, I think I'm going to enlist." And the camera then moves to her, because remember, this is now sophisticated advertising. She doesn't jump up and says, "Hooray, that's wonderful." No, the camera points to her. Of course, she's an actress, points to her, and she simply raises an eyebrow in kind of questioning. And he says, No, Mom, you know what? And furthermore, it'll make me a man." And then the ad's over with the recruiting number to call. Now, the presumption is two things: that women as mothers of sons are strapped for money when they try to think about their sons' further education. Secondly, it presumes that by 2004, 2005, in fact, a lot of mothers are very skeptical about their sons joining the U.S. military, given the operations of both Afghanistan and Iraq. But the third presumption is that any mother worth her salt is worried that her young son will not achieve satisfactory manliness. All right? And in fact, if you listen to women who have been interviewed when their sons have enlisted, who are not necessarily very patriotic in the way they talk, you will hear numbers of women who've been interviewed say, they won't use the word masculine. They'll say, "It's about time he became an adult. It's about time he grew up." And that oftentimes is a shorthand for a certain kind of mature manliness. Or it's about time he got off the couch. That's what a number of women who were interviewed in upstate New York said to a sociologist who asked, "What was your feeling about when your son came home and decided to join up?" And he said, "Well, at least he got him off the couch." And then the subtext was, "And it made me feel as though my parenting was more successful." That is, I now had a team here. That is, the Army would sort of be my ally in parenting my at loose end son. All of those things suggest that war waging requires not just women as mothers, requires women as mothers with certain ideas about motherhood, certain ideas about political action, and certain ideas about their own sense of effective parenting. Let me give you a second woman that I've been trying to keep track of. Her name is Yanar, if you're taking notes, Y-A-N-A-R, Mohammed, with only two M's, M-O-H-A-M-E-D. And Yanar Mohammed is Iraqi. She and her parents left Iraq in the middle of the Saddam Hussein regime because of the oppression and migrated to Canada. She went through university there, and when the Saddam Hussein regime was toppled, decided to go back to her hometown in Baghdad to see of whatever use she could be. Now, this is going to be a story about how ideas about security are usually kept so narrow that women's real lived insecurity is kept off our minds. Yanar Mohammed goes back, and she goes back in 2004. She quickly decides that the thing that she can be of most use at is starting a shelter with outside help, starting a shelter for battered women, including women who are being threatened with honor killings, which are building up again. They were outlawed by the Saddam Hussein regime, by the way, but they, under the intensity of violence and war, in fact, they are beginning to happen more often again. And so she creates two shelters, one in Kirkuk up in the north near the Kurdish area, and another in Baghdad. And what she has said is that when she talks to women, what she finds is that they don't trust the police. Now, this is the police that's been recreated by the U.S. Military and the U.S. government as part of rebuilding the Iraqi state. That they don't trust the police because when they go to the police to say they feel threatened, either on the street because of kidnappings, which, as you know, have increased exponentially, or because of violence in the family, either from their partners or from parents who think they aren't acting properly as respectable young women, that when they go to the police for protection, police don't take them seriously. Now, we know that happens here in Idaho, too, right? And it happens in Massachusetts, and it happens in many places in the world. But in Iraq, what police have been trained to think of themselves as is trivializing domestic violence. Because after all, they have a war to wage. This is the militarization of police. What militarization means, amongst other things, is how do you prioritize what is urgent? That is, to be militarized is to imagine as urgent a certain kind of national security, or I would say state security definition of what is a threat to security. To think that policing should trivialize, that is, neglect, pay no attention to, tell you to go off and solve your problems by yourself, mere domestic violence is part and parcel of what happens when you militarize a police department's mission and you militarize the training you give to police. This is why in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville and in other countries in the world, when you watch peacekeeping, always watch not just the training of the new military, watch the training of the new police. And in places like Bougainville and East Timor and Bosnia, one of the big success stories is that local women's groups have insisted to have a say in what kind of training the new police will get. But the United States doesn't take part in UN peacekeeping. The United States military does not wear blue helmets, which I think also has something to do with fragile masculinity. I mean, you should hear some senior officers talk about what will happen if you put on a blue helmet. I mean, there is something seriously going on here, even if it sounds sort of weird. But part of the United States not taking serious part in UN peacekeeping operations is we don't know how to train police in ways that take seriously the notions of security as experienced by the women that Yanar Mohammed is trying to assist. That is, we have so shrunken, and I mean we collectively as well as the government, we have so shrunken the notion of what is national security that we don't recognize security as lived, or better yet, insecurity as lived. Being a domestic violence advocate, that is, an anti-domestic violence advocate, in Baghdad in 2007 is being a security expert. But that kind of security thinking does not get inside the green zone. Yanar Mohammed is not one of those people who's invited inside the green zone to be part of the roundtable discussion of experts on security. But that is security expertise. All of you who've done any work in rape crisis centers or in domestic violence hotlines, you all know you're doing security work. We've actually managed, and Yanar Mohammed's experience of exclusion from the political process in the remaking of Iraq is evidence of it. We've actually so shrunken our understanding of security, we are becoming more and more unrealistic. So there are two kinds of lessons, I think. And they're thinking lessons. I don't have answers. I'm not one of these people that has kind of policy answers. But we've got two kinds of lessons from taking seriously Charlene Kane and Yanar Mohammed. With Charlene Kane, we have the lesson of paying no attention to the ways in which governments depend on women's privatization of mothering, underestimates what it takes for governments to prepare for and wage wars. Paying no attention or not too much attention to Yanar Mohammed, and there are almost 150 different Iraqi women's groups. When was the last time you saw them featured on any front page? Not very recently. You have to go on to Women's E-News. You have to go on to alternative news sources to find out about women's organizing in Iraq. To neglect Yanar Mohammed is actually de-skilling us in understanding what does it mean to be of assistance in rebuilding genuine security in any society in a way that doesn't remilitarize it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Cynthia and Enloe will now take questions from the audience. There are two mics set up, one on the other side. And
even pass, because a lot of people don't like to go to the mics, do they? Or the people that want to pass this around and then I'll deal with that?
Sure, I can do that, yes.
Who's Aaron? See, you made the mistake of introducing yourself. So that means I know your name. Be the passer around of the mic. And by the way, this won't last long. I know you've got a lot of things to do. We'll say about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll hang out and have discussion. So don't worry about that. So if you have stories, if you have experiences, it doesn't have to be a sort of straight question, although questions are fine. Thank you. If you have stories, if you have experiences, it doesn't have to be just a question. I'm happy to hear, and I know everybody else would be happy to hear those as well. So what kinds of thoughts do you have? Do you know people who are mothers of soldiers? Do you know people who are wives of veterans from the Vietnam War? I mean, how long does it take to become not a veteran? How long does it take to become not a veteran's wife?
Hi. You know, there's also women now who are returning as vets from Iraq. And there's a nameless woman on this campus who came back seriously ill from, a blood disease, is still in the National Guard. This reminds me of Charlene Kane. She's still in the National Guard. She's so ill, she she doesn't want to attend guard training because she's so ill, but she doesn't get paid if she doesn't go to guard training. That's how she, makes her living. So you see, but to be good soldier, you go and you get paid, even though she's, very, very ill from her experience there and was treated badly in a medical situation there. So talk about disease going amok, sort of, when it could have been treated much better, but wasn't treated better. She wasn't in the good Walter Reed. She wasn't treated well at all. But, when I heard the story, I'm just like, you can't take sick leave from the guard? No, you can't. If you don't show up, you don't get paid. So they're saying, so but she's in that same construct of, to be a good soldier or something. What's a good soldier?
Yeah. And in fact, this is one of the reasons, you all heard the very interesting experience here, this is one of the reasons why mental health problems that are being suffered by not all, but many soldiers who come back from Iraq. By the way, I should say also humanitarian aid workers can suffer PTSD. And as we heard earlier today, an activist in a peace group on the ground doing activist peace work in the middle of an armed conflict also can suffer PTSD. That is, PTSD is not something that you get by putting on camouflage. Right? It is being in the midst of repeated traumatic experience, or even just one traumatic experience, like being the victim of sexual assault, that is not well addressed immediately. So PTSD, we should not imagine, is simply a military mental illness. It is also a mental illness that needs to be addressed amongst all kinds of people. Just try and think of how many people in Iraq and how many people in Afghanistan suffer from PTSD, and nobody has ever dignified their trauma and their difficulty in coping with what are still very dangerous situations. Just think of how much we have taken PTSD as if it's a mark of having been in combat as a soldier of some government's uniformed force. And then be realistic about PTSD and imagine how many Iraqis are suffering PTSD with no mental health services that are accessible. And the experience that you're relating of a woman here on campus reminds me of how much the idea of soldiering can silence people in militaries from admitting that they have problems. One, structurally, if you set up the pay system so that if you call in sick, if you will, you'll lose your pay, that's structural. That's how you silence people structurally. Just work out a pay system that makes people penalized economically for speaking out about their illness, and you can be sure people are going to not speak out about their illness, and then it'll really get out of control. That's a structural way of silencing people. Then there's the cultural. That is, you create a notion about what a good soldier is. And a good soldier is somebody who, if you will, takes a deep breath, grits their teeth, and doesn't admit to having any fears. And that is what is most prevalent in not only the U.S. military, but in other militaries. There is a terrific documentary that you can get that was shown on Frontline. It was made for Frontline on PBS, and it's called The Heart of the Soldier. And it follows a small group of young men who've come back from Iraq and all the pressures on them. They are Marines. All the pressures on them not to admit that they have any mental health troubles when they came home. By the way, suicide rates are higher in the U.S. military than they've been for years. All right. Yes, please. Hi.
Hi. I was asked to stand up, but just a sort of comment that serves to accentuate what you just said, which is I teach I'm a graduate teaching assistant in the English department, and in the 4 semesters now that I've done it, I've consistently had Iraq War veterans in my classes. And I can hardly tell this story without choking up, but I had a soldier write an essay about why he was in college. and that was so that he could get a degree to re-enlist as an officer in the war, because he'd done things he felt like that no one would believe, especially not his mother. And I think it says a lot about this culture of a sort of silence and expectation that I just wanted to share. Sorry about crying.
Which also reminds us, where do we learn about war? We learn about it in... Where are the arenas where we learn about war? Are they always in a political science class? No, sometimes they're in an English class, and sometimes they're in very privately written between the professor and the student essays. What is I know how difficult it was for you and is for you, but what is a tribute is that you have taught earning enough trust that this young person could even come close to saying what he did in a way that he knew you would read it. That is, he was saying something out loud on paper to somebody. But that re-enlisting is the only way he could see of dealing with his own continuing silencing and humiliation and worry. Wow. Yes, please. Hi.
I'm trying to sort of understand whether what you're saying is in context because of the war that we're living through, because of the tremendous opposition, not just by the women, by everybody to this war, and I think a lot of the young men and women who are there as well. And so I'm thinking of the Second World War, when my mother had to support living for 4 years while her husband went to Africa and fought in that war. And do you, would you choose a person like my mother, for example? Would you be saying the same things? Or does it have something to do with the political context we're in?
I think it does have, I think you're quite right to name the time context, and also we're talking about the U.S. involved in this war. But I also think it's true that until we know more about how, probably it's going to be impossible to know but a lot more women who lived through World War II in a lot of different contexts. Jamaican women, all right, Rhodesian women, South African women, Hungarian women, Chinese women, Korean women, who lived through what we now call World War II. As mothers, we actually won't understand what it took to wage that war. And wage can be waging in a way that you and I think was ultimately necessary to do. But it does make us more realistic about what it takes to wage a good war, what it takes to wage any war. I think one of the things that I've really come to acknowledge to myself is that for all the years that I wasn't a feminist, I was never an anti-feminist, but who knew to ask feminist questions? I mean, I went through Berkeley and there were 50 faculty members in political science. Berkeley's big. There were 50 faculty members in political science. All 50 of them were men. And I didn't notice. Nobody ever talked about women in the politics courses. And I took some wonderful politics courses about the Chinese Revolution. I mean, I took some wonderful politics courses. Nobody ever thought that taking women's lives seriously was a way to understand anybody's politics. And I didn't notice. I mean, it was all so gripping. It was all so interesting. It was all so new. I didn't notice that we were only privileging the ideas and the experiences of men because they looked as though, and not all men, by the way, not all men, but particularly men who seemed to be the movers and shakers in whatever movement or country I was looking at. And so now, when I've been nudged and pushed and gently, in a friendly kind of way, towards asking feminist questions, here's what I understand. For all those years, I underestimated the amount of power it takes to make any political system work, and in particular, to wage war. That is, I've been naive, right? That not asking the ways in which women are mobilized for good wars or not good wars, depending on how you assess them. To not understand the ways in which women are depended upon by governments and by supporters of wars in the general public. I have underestimated the amount of power it takes to wage war. That means I'm a naive observer of politics. Well, none of us are going to get anywhere in either changing politics or simply trying to understand it if we underestimate the kinds and the level of power it takes to make politics. So I think with World War II, we are just, some of the best feminist historiography is now coming out about the Boer War, the Crimean War, the U.S. Civil War, and World War I, and now World War II. And we are just beginning to get a realistic handle on how much governments depended on your mother as well. That doesn't mean that having read those, we'll be more willing to think that World War II wasn't necessary. Maybe we'll, maybe we won't. But we'll at least have a better sense of what it took to wage that war when we consider good wars and unpopular wars. Thanks. Hi.
Thank you for coming to the University of Idaho, first of all. You've linked this to describing femininity and masculinity. Could you talk for a moment about empowering mothers and other women and how they define what is masculine and how that is connected, how we might find new definitions of masculinity?
I think in many societies, and I bet your sister Lorraine has ideas about this as well in Bougainville, in many societies you will hear women in their roles as teachers, as girlfriends, and as mothers, trying to rethink their own standards of masculinity, right? That is, if you think of patriarchy, which I realize is a word that is uncomfortable for some people, but I use it as simply, I use it like I do capitalism. That is, it's simply a system of privileging, right? If you think about patriarchy as one system of creating a system of privilege, in fact, patriarchy would not be able to be sustained in any society if a lot of women didn't find it rewarding. Whether it because they have certain ideas about what is a good son, or they have a certain idea about what is a protector, or they have a certain idea about what makes a good presidential candidate, or they have a certain idea about what makes an attractive boyfriend. That is, women are joined with men at all ages and in all roles in collectively constructing acceptable forms of masculinity. And so that women activists in Yugoslavia, and particularly now in Serbia, I'm being very specific now. In Turkey, I just came back from doing a series of talks and learning, actually, amongst Turkish feminists. There's a lot of discussion about masculinity amongst women activists in many countries, not because they by themselves can dictate it, but because they are complicit in whatever the dominant notions of masculinity are. It is one of the works that women involved in feminist politics, however you define it, find themselves doing today. And it's a very healthy and very important work to be going on. And it can be done by sheer talk. Yes, hi.
Hi, I'm curious about applications of what you've been talking about. Since this is, I'm just wondering if you have any good stories about when this, women have noticed the power they have over how war is waged and used it to change how a state wages war?
Yeah. I think one of the things to do, am I right, Bill Smith? Where's Bill? Bill around? Am I right that the video of Sister Lorraine's discussion last night is available? Is that true? Where's Bill?
It will be shortly in the library.
Right, and in the UI library. Okay. the reason I mention this is because Sister Lorraine's enormous value to us all is that she has done it, right? Not by herself, and she would never say by herself, but she has been crucial in the organizing of a successful, effective, grassroots movement led by women that has managed to bring an armed conflict to an end. We need to learn from other people. One of the great failings, I think, of American society, and I include myself in it, and it's partly because we're so big, we think we're so diverse already, we'll just learn from each other. I mean, it's a big deal for people from Massachusetts to learn from people from Alabama, right? But that, in fact, as Americans, we don't look at the rest of the world as places that can teach us. But in fact, most of the great movements forward against militarism are being done in other countries now. That is, to look at the women in black groups in, I'm going to be very specific now, in Belgrade, in Jerusalem, in Spain, in Tokyo, to look at the women in black groups, to look at the women living under Muslim law. That's the name of the group. It's an international coalition. Those are groups that we all could learn from. Americans are just not going to be able to solve our own problems if we think that we can just draw on each other. We are great teachers of the world, but we are really lousy students. And I really want to give you all such credit for inviting Sister Lorraine here, for actually sitting here, and if you watch the video as a learner, thinking, there's somebody I can learn from. There's somebody that, in fact, can push us further along the road as to how to roll back militarism. There are some very good anti-militarist activists here in the United States. I don't want to downplay that, but it's not enough anymore, and we may not be the best anyway. Well, there's living proof we're not the best, right? But we really need to figure out who to listen to and how to make sure that they have the chance to teach us. Let's take two more comments, questions. Hi.
Hi, I was intrigued by your description of the African-American kitchen table military recruiting ad. And maybe this was so obvious it doesn't bear comment, but it struck me kind of gradually in hearing that and thinking about that there are two insecurities that are being played on there. One, how am I, from the point of view of the mother, to provide for my son's economic future? And number two, how am I as a mother to see to the development of my son's masculinity? It seems to me that there's a deeply disturbingly racialized message in that ad. Is it an accident that she's African American? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I do think there is the whole history of discourse within the African American community that the John Burnett advertising agency is very well aware of, which is the discourse within the African American community about motherhood and the masculinity of sons, right? And they, remember, advertising agency read a lot of social science. The other thing, though, that is going on is that actually African American mothers have begun to question their long-standing belief that their sons and daughters going into the U.S. military, in fact, was one road to success in the United States. For a long time, the Defense Department, every year in high schools, amongst 15-year-olds, do what are called propensity studies. This is DOD talk. Propensity studies. And here's the question they ask. And they do polling and sampling and all. They have a lot of social scientists working for them, the Defense Department. They ask this question of 15-year-olds, boys and girls. Can you imagine any time in the future when you might consider enlisting in the military? So they put in lots of conditionals. They're not saying, as a 15-year-old, do you plan to enlist? As a 17-year-old, will you enlist? This is why they're called propensity studies. Can you imagine any time in the future when you might consider enlisting in the military? Now, these propensity studies, they mull these over, they watch them by region, they watch them by ethnicity and race, they watch them by gender, and for years, African Americans were amongst those 15-year-olds who rated very high that they could imagine. Because many African American young people have mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and older cousins who've been in the military. Of the active duty military, African American men have made up about 30% of all men in the U.S. Army, for instance. In the Army, amongst all women, okay, now you got to really think like this, okay. Think of all women in the U.S. Army. Thinking about just all the women in the U.S. Army. Now imagine what percentage of all women in the U.S. Army are African American. Now the way to make the guess is to think what percentage are African American women of all women in the U.S.? About 11%, the same as they are of the general public, right? About 11%. So 11% is kind of your measure, right? And are you going to guess they're fewer than 11% or more than 11%? So these are now figures from about from about 2003. So what would you guess of all women now in the enlisted ranks? The officer corps is small. In the enlisted ranks of the U.S. Army, given that 11% is what would be if it were kind of just random, what percent of all women in the U.S. Army were African American in 2003? 60%, not quite that high, but 48%. 48%. And nobody talks about it. Ever heard an issue about it? Ever heard anyone say, my God, what's happening? What this means, amongst other things, is that there is a tradition within that has made a lot of sense within the African American community that joining the military is in fact a way to get an education, it's a way to prove you belong, it's a way to gain a sense of first-class citizenship, it is a way to get out of poor communities. There are a lot of reasons. In the most recent propensity studies amongst 15-year-olds, there is a sharp decline for the first time in decades amongst African American teenagers, especially boys, in their propensity to imagine any circumstances in which they would join the military. Now, that ad is based on anxiety coming out of that study. Because we all know as teenagers, all of us, that in fact your notion about what is possible in the future comes partly from your notion of your mom and your dad's notion about what is possible and reasonable and what you should keep in mind even if you aren't going to commit yourself to it. I think that ad, and that was such a good question, I think it comes out of both plugging into what is a long-standing discourse and debate within the African community about single motherhood, of sons especially, and the very immediate downturn in 15-year-old African Americans' attitudes towards the military. By the way, amongst Latinos, it is just about, it's plateaued. It hasn't declined. And that's one of the reasons that you find Defense Department ads now on Spanish language soccer game television shows. Okay, now, how are we doing on time? I promise I'm going on too long. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You make your comment or question short, and I'll be even shorter in my reply, I promise. Okay, it's a deal.
All right. Actually, mine's pretty short. My boyfriend goes to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and there's an association of girlfriends who are expected to be a support system for these boys. Mind you, only about 2% of cadets actually have long-term girlfriends all 4 years. But being a part of the group, you're seen as something lesser than, a full woman, because you are, after all, marked by your boyfriend's rank and company. And the girls do rank themselves, and they do wear name tags. But if you don't belong to the group, then as cadets, they're not even full officers yet. And this is that they have an inter-academy organization, and each academy has its own organization of girlfriends, and they are official with the Association of Graduates at each of the academies now. They have their own gift shop. But what's interesting about it, if you belong, then of course the other cadets cajole you when you attend the functions there to support your boyfriend. And if you don't belong, then you're seen as lesser amongst the women. And so my question for you is, how do we promote caring without promoting the system that's demeaning to us?
You are fabulous. Because, okay, my guess is because you're all here, you're all kind of news junkies, right? I mean, you kind of watch the news and then you watch different news and then, so how many of you knew that? Yeah, okay, but no, that's good. So, and you knew about the girlfriend. That kind of information is so crucial because it says, once again, why does the military think it can't wage war without co-opting girlfriends? Or without co-opting a young woman who is defined by them mainly in her role as a girlfriend, since you are much more than a girlfriend, but in terms of West Point and the Defense Department, that's mainly who you are. But the thing is, they're nervous about you. That's the good news, right? Right? They are. Because why would they try so hard in such a conscious, explicit way to organize you if they didn't think that if you weren't organized, you might encourage him to have the kind of questions all of us do when we're in college? So my sense is have really good discussions. I mean, you're good friends. Have good discussions about the difference between your and he caring for each other as thinking people and the Defense Department's notion of what girlfriend-boyfriend relationships mean for their foreign policy. But that means that politics and political action, because sometimes it'll be hard to have these conversations. We sometimes think that what is politically difficult to do is to go out where there are armed police in a demonstration. But having that conversation, just tete-a-tete, and then when it's difficult the first time, having it the second time, that's political action.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Enloe, thank you for speaking to my sociology class today. It was very interesting. Guatemala. 2 years ago, January of 2005, my oldest son, surprised me with a phone call saying that he had joined the Army. And he is a person that I would have never expected in my wildest dreams that would join. He's currently serving in Iraq, in Baghdad. He's the gunner on a Humvee. And so it's, as you can imagine, pretty scary, but we communicate often by email. Last Saturday, while I was away, I was on a business trip, I work for the university, and he emailed me, and it started out by saying, "Mom, please don't freak out." I know. He knows me well. But today, the medic in my unit stepped on an IED and you learn very quickly when your child is in the Army, everything is an acronym. They don't use words. So he said KIA, which means killed in action. And he went on to say in his email, it was pretty short, that he felt bad for the young man's family, but that he didn't feel sad about this happening. And none of you know my son, maybe Sarah Nelson over there a little bit, but he is the sweetest, gentlest person ever. And so my heart broke for him because I know that while he's there in Baghdad, he has to pretend that that doesn't matter because it will impact his safety if he's worried and grieving about his friend that was just killed. But it also scares me because I know he's going to come home and he will have to deal with that. And I think that's what my reply was to him, is that, son, you don't have to think about it right now, but someday you will. And I'll be there for you. So, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And the thing is that you, personally, when he comes home, you shouldn't have to do it by yourself. All right? Wars don't end. Wars go on as long as you feel that you have to support your son after the war in working through things that he's now denying, means the war is going on. Wars go on much longer than, not the kind of history books that Sean writes, which are much more realistic, but in kind of the easy, when did the war end kind of renditions, they go on much longer. And what it really means for all of us to be realistic is that your Iraq war is now likely to go on for quite some time, and that you definitely not do it by yourself. Right. Thank you very much. It was very generous of you.
Cynthia, we've had
two more.
Can you hear me?
Well, how
Cynthia?
did we multiply?
We've had a woman waiting here in the middle too for a bit.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak to something that came up earlier when we were talking about views of masculinity in the culture. And one of my own, I know that Harry Edwards, the sociologist who was writing a while ago at Berkeley, talked about sports, organized sports, as a way to enculturate boys into a military mindset. They have numbers, and you do it for the coach, and you suck up and don't acknowledge weaknesses. And I just wondered if there's a connection between how mothers are also socialized in that setting, where you plan the bake sales and the potlucks afterwards, and you're really physically separated from the athlete, and you just sit in the bleachers. And to me, that seems like preparation for what mothers are supposed to do for the military too.
I think that's true. I mean, I think oftentimes that women are socialized to think that they are their true selves when they're silent supporters. But maybe that's not their truest selves, our truest selves, and maybe it's not the most useful self to be. As all the stories about the NFL players who have now suffered long-term injury because of multiple concussions and early onset of Alzheimer's, you've been reading this. How many women are thinking, maybe I should have fought a second time? I don't mean to be blaming them, but the thing is, how much pressure was on them to not say anything when their son in high school was knocked out during an ice hockey game, or in college during a football game, because that would be a mother dampening their son's sports enthusiasm and even masculinity. So it really does question the whole premise of what is a good mother. That is, a good mother is a supportive, spectating, silent mother. And that isn't a full human being. And it definitely isn't a citizen. Yes, please. Hi. You've been very good to wait.
Thank you. Your discussion, in my view, points to the fact that women are increasingly relied upon during the mobilization for war, which brings me to the tentative conclusion that behind every fighting soldier or politician who decides to go to war, there is a woman behind that particular person supporting. So can we say that women are entirely innocent in terms of the causes of war in this case? I mean, I watched a documentary about Milosevic, and clearly all the politicians that were interviewed confirmed that it was actually his wife who pushed him into most of the decisions he took. And it is so in many other instances. So in terms of the causes of war, my position is that women are not entirely innocent. And women have also taken active part during wars too. And then you talked about the consequences of war, where women had to bear the brunt of the problems that came about, citing the instances of those two ladies. Well, in the immediate causes of war, effects of war, it's often the case that they are victims in terms of being raped or abused in many other forms. But looking at the long-term impact of wars, several case studies have actually indicated that women emerge as winners, not as losers. There are instances, case studies on Ethiopian families who migrated to Canada, and other case studies about Mayan families who were actually studied after the wars in those countries. Looking at patriarchal societies like we have in the third world, most third world, Africa, South America, the gender imbalance is an issue most feminists are dealing with. And the argument is that war actually provides a very unique opportunity for the redistribution of power. And at the end of the day, they emerge as winners, not as losers. So my point here is that women are not innocent.
I think your points are very important to take on board. My understanding, and this is one of the things I was exploring tonight, was that in fact, because women are encouraged by governments to support, some women are encouraged by governments to support war, in fact, it is very important to look at the militarization of women's lives, right? That's a reflective thing, and you're encouraging that as well. That is, that women as well as men should really think hard about the ways in which they may, in quite surprising fashion, give permission to or silently allow happen war waging. The countries in which women at the ends of certain kinds of wars, particularly devastating wars, and the ones that are particularly notable, of course, are Rwanda after 1994 and Cambodia after the Pol Pot genocide or attempted genocide in the 1980s, where, in fact, women became over 60% of the remaining population. Whether one should then call those women winners, I'm not so sure. That is, that it is true now that Rwanda, you probably know this, Rwanda now has the highest percentage of women in the national legislature of any country in the world. That's 48%. Sweden comes next. Other Scandinavian countries come, and then South Africa comes, and you can't even find the United States, it's 58th, right? Now, one could say that 48% is a redistribution of political influence. It's still not even 50%, even though women are 60% of the society. But it is certainly true that in the midst of and after every war, one should ask, what has that particular armed conflict done to the relationships between men and women? So that in Rwanda, one of the things that had to happen after the war, didn't have to happen, it did happen, those women who were left as widows after the genocide, many women were killed, but even more men were killed, that those women who were left as widows, one of the first political actions they organized around was to change the Rwandan national law of inheritance. That inheritance law, which had been inherited itself from the Belgian colonialists, but had been left in place by the independent Rwandan government before 1994, was a law that privileged the brothers of men who died when it came to the redistribution of family assets. And the women's new organizations in Rwanda, one of the first things they did was to organize, to change, to reform the inheritance law. Did that happen because of the terrible loss of male and female life in Rwanda? Absolutely. Is it women winning? I'm not so sure that's how I would define it. But I certainly do think that many women in certain wars do come away from wars imagining that wartime was good for them. And that is particularly the myth of Rosie the Riveter in the United States as taught by certain stories of World War II and women for the first time getting decent paying industrial jobs, particularly as welders. And every time you see that, you know, the poster in the T-shirt of "you can do it, we can do it," that's a state poster, that's a state war waging poster to recruit women into military, into industrial ammunition jobs. Whether that's the lesson of World War II about women, that is that World War II was good for women because it got them decent paying jobs that they couldn't get by union organizing. But when you look at 1946, by 1946, the government had organized a campaign to make sure that almost all women left all those good paying industrial jobs. So the woman welder who was getting good pay in 1944, by 1948, she was working again as a maid or not having any pay at all. So I think your comment is a really good caveat, a really good warning. That is, take women specifically, chart them all the way through wars, see what happens to the relationships between women and men at the beginning of a war, in the middle of the war, towards the end of the war, the couple of years after the war, and 5 years after that. But I'm not so sure. In most wars, almost everybody loses. The question is, what do you do with your losingness as you relate to each other after the war? Yes, please. Hi.
Hi. My brother was in the Army, and 2 weeks actually when he was on his R&R, he came home and was talking and, you know, hanging out with all his friends, doing his thing. But every time I would talk to him about going back, all he would say was he felt that he needed to be there because he was with his buddies and he felt like he was protecting and he felt like he was actually doing something good for our country. And I guess he's kind of rare maybe because when he was 10, he rode his bike to the Army recruiting office. So it was kind of, you know, he's kind of known that that's what he wanted to do for his whole life. 2 weeks after he left, he was actually killed on a Humvee. He was the gunner on top of a Humvee. And they say it was they say, or they tell me, or whatever you want to say, that a vehicle came underneath his Humvee and it rolled over and he didn't have time to get out from the top. But either way, I've had the chance to kind of watch my mom grieve and see how she does it herself. And my question kind of regards what you were talking about with Cindy Sheehan, because I try not to be a little bit biased, but, you know, my mom thinks Cindy Sheehan's a lunatic. And I mean, she feels as if though she is dishonoring her son by saying the thing, you know, all these things that she said. And by going, you know, out in public, you wonder almost what her son would come back and say to her. Because I know that if my brother were alive, he would, and my mom were saying some of those things, that he would come back and slap the, you know, he would not be very happy with her. And what I want to know is how you think that, if you think Cindy Sheehan has actually helped this process, because I honestly think that she's dishonoring a lot of the soldiers that are over there by saying, you know, by talking a lot about, you know, how the war shouldn't be going on either way. Because if you have opinions on the war, I personally myself think that you should let them be until the war is over, because the worst thing that you could be doing is saying that those soldiers shouldn't be over there because they're fighting for everybody here. And so when these women or men or whoever saying all these things about how, all these negative things about the war and about our president, maybe all of that's true, but by coming out and saying it, and I feel as if though you're dishonoring a lot of the soldiers that are over there, thinking that they're doing the right thing because they're there to save, to, you know, to keep everybody here safe.
You know, I think it is, and I'm sure this is something that you continue to sort of struggle with. I think it is really hard to find a way to talk about a civilian government's foreign policy. None of the soldiers who are in Iraq made the foreign policy. They're following orders, and they're trying to do the best they can. And as your brother said to you, their first responsibility is to their buddies, and they're trying to be as good fellow soldiers to their immediate buddies as they possibly can. They didn't make the foreign policy. They weren't at the table. So then the question becomes, and it's really a puzzle, it's not just a question, it's a puzzle. How can any of us, when we care for individual and whole groups of young and not so young men and women in a government's army, how can we both care for them and find some way to, as citizens, make what we need to do, because that's what it means to be a citizen, to come to kind of an assessment, pro or con. You can come to a positive assessment too, about the government's foreign policy. What seems to be so like a trap is that for families of both severely wounded and killed soldiers, it seems like there is no space. There is no space to make both assessments, to kind of incorporate one's grief and one's caring, and also be the person who is responsible for coming to some assessment of one's government's actions. And that collapsing of space, as if there is no place to stand, it seems to me like just this horrible conundrum. And I think you're right that Cindy Sheehan, by breaking open that conundrum, has left many of us trying to think, well, is she dishonoring him? What she says is that she is honoring him by trying to make an assessment of not his actions, his government's actions that sent him there. I think one of the reasons that not only she, but now there are groups of women of fallen soldiers who have joined her, called the 5-Star Women Mothers Against the War, that they themselves have taken an enormous risk because it's we who can't hear that distinction. We are the ones who can't hear the difference between grief and a citizen's assessment of one's government. And it is a terrible dilemma, and I think you're absolutely right about that. And you will work it out in your own intelligent, smart way, as will your mother. But it is a conundrum, and it's a conundrum that has been crafted by not you and not by your mother. And how you deal with a conundrum that has been imposed on you to be a good, thoughtful citizen, which you must be, and a good, caring, grieving sister and mother, which you must be. That's tough. That is really tough.
Hi, thanks for taking me. You've been very gracious and eloquent and very powerful in all of your answers. Cynthia, I wanted to ask you something that's constantly on my heart. And I guess I'll start from maybe, I think it was a question either you asked or someone in the audience, and it's where do we learn about war? Where do we learn this? What are the roots here in this part of the world, in this hemisphere? I'm Lipan Apache from Calabos. I'm from the place called Tamaulipan, which is the place where the Lipan pray in northern Mexico and the southern part of Texas. And I'm also Humano Apache from West Texas, from a small community called Redford, which came onto the national scene when my cousin was taken out by Marines in ghillie suits. And some people may have seen this in different places of the internet. And my community has been at war with the United States government since the day that Ezekiel was taken from us by a low-intensity conflict. So my first response to this question, where do we learn about war? I have to first acknowledge the ancestors that are here in this place. As an indigenous person, that this university is built on Nimipu land. for thousands of years back. And so my first response to that question, it was like a knee-jerk, and it's cowboys and Indians. And so I want to ask you about how you see war as a U.S. citizen. Citizenship was forced on my people. My grandfather served in World War II. He did not want to go, and none of our community, I'm matrilineal, none of the women in my community offered our people to the United States. He was forced to go at the end of a gun. We have, a long history of forced conscription that way. And my father, he served in the Air Force, and he was also forced to go into the Air Force. He had received a scholarship to go to Baylor because he was a 4-year letterman in high school. And but his father, my grandfather, was an alcoholic, and he didn't have a way to take care of 9 children. And my father was the only one who had been, given a chance to go to college. But my grandfather thought that it would be better if he went to the Army, because then he would perhaps be able to get, some money into the household that way. So our relationship with the United States has always been one of violence inherently, and conflict and resistance to these wars. My people consider this government one that feeds and is fueled by death. And the elder women's societies consider the way that this government perpetuates death upon its own people as like a death culture. We say that. Given that, my community has been assaulted again. My mother has been shot at on her own land. We're binational indigenous people all along the 2,000-mile-long border between Mexico and the U.S. is the international boundary line. It's an official, supranational organization that really is not within the regulatory powers or supervision of either Mexico or the U.S. It's its own entity. And so all indigenous people who are binational there are underneath that government, that sort of control, as well as the governments of the United States and Mexico, as well as many layers of policing and, as maybe you would say, hyper-militarism. No? So we have Border Patrol, we have Mexican soldiers and the United States soldiers. We have local sheriff, we have tribal police, we have nationalists, militants who shoot at elders, such as my mother when she walks on her land and attempts to walk onto our cornfields on the other side. Recently, there have been over 14,000 U.S. soldiers deployed to our communities. And this continues to be a space that is not debated within the national discourse of the war on terror and the war abroad. And I feel that, especially here within the space being very far away from where I'm from, that particular war and low-intensity conflict has immense implications here in the Northwest, when we have numerous tribes who are binational to Canada and the United States as well. In addition to that, it is being estimated by feminist scholars from Mexico and Guatemala that over 90% of the migrants who are displaced by U.S. war on terror from southern Mexico and Guatemala are being displaced. So the majority of people who are trying to move into more secure and peaceful circumstances within a space within the U.S. boundaries are indigenous people to North America. So I'm just wondering, listening to all of the different comparisons that you make in your work, how do you configure that?
Margot's comments, and Margot and I had a chance to meet just today. Margot's comments really are really a very good way to end, I think, because what they remind us is there's war that's visible and that's organized and that's called war. And then there are wars which may not be called wars, because if you called them wars, you change the politics of them. And then there's militarism, all of which Margot so graphically described. There's militarism, which is a way of organizing stories and organizing our imaginings about the other, and organizing our notion about danger, and organizing our notions and our measures of security. And militarism can go on even after wars have ended. And it lies there waiting for the next visible war, but at the same time, it is oppressive for people who have to live at the wrong end of the militarism culture. So for all of us, it means no matter what your skills are, or what your interests are, what kind of activism you take part, you can actually be part of the solution by actually thinking about where militarization is in your own storytelling, where militarization is in what you pay attention to and what you don't pay attention to, where militarization is in whose voices you take as expert and whose voices you think of as just naive. It means that there's a lot of work for all of us to do. Thank you very much.